Hello everybody, welcome to the video. My name is Nihir and today in this video I will be covering the fourth chapter of the first unit of the IB Business Curriculum, 1.4 Stakeholders. So before we start with the content, I would like to just introduce this chapter to you guys a little bit. Firstly, this is a relatively shorter chapter. It contains only two subtopics. The first one is internal and external stakeholders, and the second one is conflict between stakeholders. Also, I just want to state that the assessment objective for this chapter is an AO2. So for example, in your exams, you guys must be prepared to answer some questions about the differences between internal and external stakeholders, or maybe you must also be prepared to answer some questions about the differences between stakeholders and shareholders, and some questions about the various objectives of different stakeholder groups and how these objectives might conflict with each other. And also when answering 10-marker AO3 questions, knowing the information from this chapter and applying your knowledge when you're answering those 10-marker questions, the AO3 questions, AO3 assessment objective questions, this chapter is really useful for answering 10 markers. As in most of the case studies, you can see that how different stakeholders are included. And for example, when you're making decisions in those 10 markers, using the information that you learned from this chapter can be really helpful. Yeah, that was just a quick tip. Okay, so now let's start talking about stakeholders. Okay, so when you're thinking of an organization, we might sometimes think of it as a single unit that makes decisions as one entity, but this is not the reality. Actually, organizations, as we know, they are made up of different groups, and these different groups are called stakeholders. And these stakeholders might often compete for influence and control. Okay, so a stakeholder is any individual or group that affects or is affected by the business itself or by an organization. So the actual definition of this term is any individual group or organization with an interest or involvement in the operations and performance of a business. Also, we can categorize stakeholders as either internal or external. And as stakeholders are groups or individuals that affects or is affected by an organization, we expect them to be impacted by the activities of the organization or the business itself. So here in the slide, as you can see, there's a little diagram of the stakeholders, of the different groups of stakeholders of this railway company in the middle. So here we can see the internal stakeholders. Some examples include employees, owners and shareholders, and managers. And on the top, you can see the external stakeholders, and some examples include pressure groups, suppliers, the government itself, banks or financiers, media, the competitors, and the customers. So as you can see, there are a lot of different groups that are categorized as that are classified as stakeholders of a business. And here you can see all of these groups actually have an interest, or they are involved in the activities of the business. So here we can see the employees, for example, the employees that work in the railway company might be impacted by the decisions that the managers make within the company. So you can see how they're actually impacted by the company itself. And also when the managers of a company wants to change something or wants to make a decision, they must consider different stakeholders all the time, different groups of stakeholders all the time. For example, they must consider the needs of the employees or their demands, or they must consider what the customers might want from them, or they must always think about the suppliers and even the local community itself. So yeah, because all of these groups have an interest in the business's activities, the managers or the CEOs, when they're launching a new product, for example, from a different example, let's say that the CEO of a technological company is launching a new product, and they must consider different stakeholder groups because all of these groups have an interest in the business's activities. Okay, so now I would like to talk about internal stakeholders. So internal stakeholders are actually groups, individuals or groups that are directly involved in the organization and its operations. They have a direct interest in the business's performance and decision making. So when we're thinking of internal stakeholders, we must always remember that they have a direct influence. So they're actually within the organization. They're actually inside the organization. Okay, an individual or group that affects or is affected by an organization and is directly involved inside the organization. This is the actual definition of internal stakeholders. And there are different types of internal stakeholders, and the examples are like internal stakeholders include managers or directors, employees, and shareholders. Okay, so here are the internal stakeholders. Remember, the internal stakeholders were classified as internal because they are considered to be inside the organization. And on the other hand, the external stakeholders were classified as external because they are considered to be outside the organization. So now we're talking about internal stakeholders. Okay, so let's talk about employees first. Employees are the staff of an organization. They are the individuals who work for a company. So the primary objective of employees is to actually earn a living, is to gain money, and they usually strive to improve their pay. They also want to improve their working conditions, such as the hours of work and the physical working environment, and job security and opportunities for their career's progression. And secondly, the managers are the people who actually oversee the daily operations of a business. They are the individuals who are responsible for the day-to-day operations of a company. And their primary objective is to actually meet the company's goals and objectives. And they usually want to maximize their profits, and they want to minimize their costs while ensuring that the company operates efficiently as possible. And finally, the shareholders. So shareholders are the individuals or entities who own a portion of a company's shares or stock. So shareholders actually invest in the company, and they have the goal of making a profit. And as they invest in the company, they want to actually maximize the returns of the investment itself, and that is basically their primary objective. And to maximize the returns of the investment, they expect the company to be profitable, and they want the business or like the organization or the company, whatever, to generate a high return on their investment. They expect profit. So these are all of the different groups of internal stakeholders: employees, managers or directors, and shareholders. So before we move on to external stakeholders, I just want to remind you guys something that is quite important. So some shareholders are actually internal stakeholders. For example, if we have employees who are involved in the business, who are inside the business, and if they hold shares in the company, they are classified as internal stakeholders. But some shareholders can be external stakeholders. So if an individual owns shares in the company, but they are not directly involved in the daily operations of the business, they are classified as external stakeholders. So for example, as an individual, if I purchase the shares of a company, I am not directly involved in the daily operations of the business, right? So I am classified as an external stakeholder. However, on the other hand, if we are like thinking about limited liability companies, which was covered in chapter 2, these companies are actually owned by their shareholders. So the shareholders are actually directly involved within the operations of a business. They're inside the business, inside the company itself. So they can be classified as internal stakeholders. So it is really important that we must remember this piece of information, because sometimes in some resources, shareholders are classified as only external or only internal, but it actually depends on the context. Okay, so now let's talk about external stakeholders. So external stakeholders are actually outside the organization, but they're still affected by the organization's activities, or they have an interest in its performance. So these can be either like individuals, or they can be groups, but they must be outside the organization. They mustn't be directly involved within the business. They don't directly work for the business, but they can influence, or they can be influenced by the business's actions. So the full definition is an individual or group that affects or is affected by an organization, but who's not directly involved inside the organization. External stakeholders have less influence over the organization than internal stakeholders. However, this is like super important. External stakeholders have less influence over the organization than internal stakeholders, but this does not mean that they can be ignored. And examples of external stakeholders include customers, suppliers, financiers, the government, the local community, or like the society, and pressure groups. Okay, so here are the different groups of external stakeholders. Firstly, we have the customers. So the customers are the individuals or businesses who purchase goods from a business. A reminder that businesses can also be customers. For example, if there's a B2B kind of like a B2B relationship between businesses. For example, if a business purchases for example, their inputs from another business, this is a B2B relationship. So just a reminder that businesses can also be classified as customers as well. So these are the individuals or businesses who purchase goods from a business. And the primary objective of customers is to receive high-quality products or services at a fair price. So just think of yourselves. If, let's say that you love shopping from a certain clothing brand, and you wouldn't want the prices of the brand of their like clothing items to be really, really high. You don't want the prices to be super expensive. You want to buy the products at a fair price, and you want the clothing item to be high quality, and you want it to be affordable. So this is kind of like your primary objective as a customer of a business. Because I mean, like, who wants to pay a lot of money for like a really bad quality clothing item? I don't think anybody would want to do that. So yeah, you can just like think of real life examples when you're thinking of external stakeholders. For example, like customers, they want to receive high quality products at a fair price. Okay, end of sentence. Customers, they also want good customer service, and they want a positive experience with the company. For example, as a customer, if you're buying a smartphone, you expect the smartphone to be durable, and you would expect the company to provide you after-sales support. Secondly, suppliers. Suppliers provide a business with stocks of raw materials needed for production. So, as you know, a business needs inputs to produce outputs. So suppliers are responsible for providing the business with inputs or like stocks of raw materials that the business needs for production. So the suppliers want to be paid prices that are both fair and reasonable for the inputs, and they actually want to be able to establish a long-term arrangement or like long-term agreements with their customers to improve the business's stability. And financiers could be like banks or different kind of like financial like organizations, and they lend organizations or businesses money so they can invest, so the business itself can invest and carry out their operations. And financiers want to be sure that these loans are paid back. So as the business loans the money that the financiers are paying them, financiers want to be sure that the loans are being paid back with interest and on time. And then there's the government. The government is responsible for creating and enforcing laws and regulations that affect businesses, and the primary objective for the government is to promote the public good and protect the interests of citizens. And they also want companies to operate within the law and contribute to the local economy. So, for example, the companies must create new job opportunities within a society, and this is something that the government expects. And we have the local community. The local community includes individuals and organizations that live or operate in the area where a business operates. And the primary objective of the local community is they want the business to have a positive impact on the community. So this is what the local community expects from the business. They want the business to have a positive influence on themselves. And for example, this may include the business being environmentally responsible, like they want the business to provide jobs, and they want the business to contribute to local causes. And finally, the pressure groups. The pressure groups are the organizations that seek to influence the policies and actions of business businesses or governments, and their primary objective is to promote a specific cause. For example, this could be they could promote, you know, for example, they could talk about climate change, these pressure groups, and they could actually force the businesses to be more responsible about the issue of the specific issue of climate change. And they want the businesses to support their cause or take action on an issue, for example, climate change. Also, they might advocate for pollution control. For example, if there's a factory and if the factory pollutes the waters in the area where it operates, these pressure groups might force the businesses to be more considerate of how they're harming the environment. And they can also support the local community. Okay, so this is all for external stakeholders. And now let's talk about conflicts between stakeholders. So as we know, different stakeholder groups, they have different interests and objectives So these interests and objectives might conflict. So stakeholder groups can have conflicting interests and objectives. And this can actually lead to tensions and conflicts. So for example, shareholders may prioritize maximizing profits, while employees might prioritize fair treatment of themselves and high wages. Another example could be customers might prioritize low prices, while the local community may prioritize environmental sustainability. And environmental sustainability raises costs and prices for the business because, for example, if you're using environmentally sustainable packaging, you might need to buy recycled packaging, and the recycled packaging might be more expensive than the usual packaging that you use. For example, buying recycled plastic bags for a business might increase their costs. And here are these were some examples of some conflicts between stakeholders. And these conflicts can create challenges for businesses trying to balance the competing demands of different stakeholder groups. For example, a company may need to invest in costly environmental technology to meet the demands of the local community, but this might reduce their profitability, and this might upset shareholders because as shareholders expect the business to be highly profitable so that they can get high returns of their initial investments, this could upset them. And conflicts can also arise when stakeholders have different levels of power and influence over the business. Pressure groups with strong public support may be able to influence business activity more than individual shareholders. So here's a table that you can make use of when learning about the conflict. For example, here we have the different stakeholder groups, employees and employers. Here's an example. For example, British Airways announced 12,000 job cuts and pay reductions due to COVID-19, due to the pandemic. And the conflict was unions and staff protested and launched legal challenges, arguing workers were unfairly targeted. So this is an example of a conflict between the employees and their employers, or managers. So here are some other examples, and maybe you can note them down. So this was all for today's video, and thank you so much for listening, and good luck with everything.